Hi boys and girls, this is Miss Simpson here, and welcome back to another video of our Read Aloud series for the book The BFG by Roald Dahl. I'm glad to have you with us today. We are going to keep on moving with our story, and we're going to continue to find out what's going on in our adventure with our two characters that we know so far, with Sophie, who was the orphan, and with the BFG, who we now know is the big friendly giant. So last where we left off, we were learning that the BFG had these big, marvelous ears. And if you remember, he could hear almost everything. So he could hear the smallest little sounds, ants chit-chatting with each other, and spiders singing away as they made their webs. So now we're going to continue where we left off, and we're going to find out what is going to happen next with Sophie and our giant. So we're going to jump right in. The next chapter is called Snozzcumbers. Now remember, something that we haven't talked about too much yet is that they do use a lot of really silly words in this story. So I hope you can still follow along as best you can, even though they do use some really silly words. So back to the story, Snozzcumbers. But if you don't eat people like all the others, Sophie said, then what do you live on? That is a squelching, tricky problem around here, the BFG answered. In this slosh-flunking giant country, happy eats like pineapples and pigwinkles is simply not growing. Nothing is growing except for one extremely icky poo vegetable. It's called a snozzcumber. The snozzcumber, cried Sophie. There's no such thing. The BFG looked at Sophie, smiled, and showed about 20 of his square white teeth. Yesterday, he said, we was not believin' in giants, was we? Today, we is not believin' in snozzcumbers. Just because we happen to not have actually seen something with our own eyes doesn't mean that it's not existing. What about, for instance, the great squizzly Scotch hopper? I beg your pardon, Sophie said. And the hupplecrimp. The what? Sophie said. And the rapsackle. The what? Sophie said. And the crumbscoddle. Are they animals? Sophie asked. These is common animals, said the BFG contemptuously. I is not very well all-knowing giant myself, but it seems to me that yous is an absolutely know-nothing human being, and your brain is full of rotten wool. You mean cotton wool, Sophie said. What I mean and what I say is two different things, the BFG announced rather grandly. I will now show you a snozzcumber. The BFG flung open a massive cupboard and took out the weirdest looking thing Sophie had ever seen. It was about half as long as an ordinary man, but it was much thicker. It was as thick around its girth as a perambulator. It was black with white stripes along its length, and it was all covered in coarse knobbles. Here is the repulsant snozzcumber, cried the BFG, waving it about. I squoggle it, I mispise it, I desponge it, but because Eyes is refusing to gobble up human beings like all the other giants, I must spend my life guzzling up icky poo snozzcumbers instead. And if I don't, I would be nothing but skin and groans. You mean skin and bones, Sophie said. I know it's bones, said the BFG, but please understand that I cannot be helping it if I sometimes say things a little bit squiggly. I try my very best, all the time. The big friendly giant looked suddenly so forlorn that Sophie got quite upset. I'm sorry, she said. I did not mean to be rude. There never was any schools to teach me talking in giant country, said the BFG sadly. But couldn't your mother have taught you? Sophie asked. My mother? Ha! Cried the BFG. Giants don't have mothers. Surely you know that. I did not know that, Sophie said. Who's ever heard of a woman giant? Shouted the BFG, waving a Snozzcumber around his head like a lasso. There never was a woman giant, and there never will be one. Giants is always men. Sophie felt herself getting a little muddled. In that case, she said, how were you born? Giants isn't born, the BFG answered. Giants appears. That's all. They simply appears, the same way the sun does and the stars do. And so when did you appear? Sophie asked. Now how on earth could I be knowing a thing like that, said the BFG. It was so long ago, I couldn't count. You mean you don't even know how old you are? No giant is knowing that, the BFG said. All I's is knowing about myself is that I's is very old. Very, very, very old and crumply. Perhaps as old as the earth. What happens when a giant dies? Sophie asked. Giants is never dying, the BFG answered. Sometimes, and quite suddenly, a giant is disappearing and nobody is ever knowing where he goes to. But mostly, us giants is simply going on and on like whiffsy time twiddlers. The BFG was still holding the awesome Snozzcumber in his right hand, and now he put one end in his mouth and bit off a huge hunk of it. He started crunching it up, and the noise he made was like the crunching of lumps of ice. It's filthing, he sputtered, speaking with his mouth full and spraying large pieces of Snozzcumber like bullets in Sophie's direction. Sophie hopped around on the tabletop, ducking out of the way. It's disgustrous, said the BFG. It's sickable, it's rotsome, it's maggot-wise. Try it yourself. It's a foulsome Snozzcumber. No, thank you, Sophie said, backing away. It's all you're going to be guzzling around here from now on, so you might as well get used to it, said the BFG. Go on, you snipsy little winkle, go have a go. Sophie took a small nibble. Ugh, she spluttered. Oh no, oh gosh, oh help. She spat it out quickly. It tastes of frog skins, she gasped, and rotten fish. Worse than that, cried the BFG, roaring with laughter. To me, it tastes of cockroaches and slime wranglers. Do we really have to eat it? Sophie said. You do, unless you want it to become so thin that you'll be disappearing into thin air, Sophie said. A thick ear is something very different. Once again, that sad, winsome look came into the BFG's eyes. Words, he said, is oh such twitch-tickling problems to me all my life. So you must simply try to be patient and stop squibbling. As I am telling you before, I know exactly what words I am wanting to say, but somehow or another there's always getting squiff-squiddled around. That happens to everyone, Sophie said. Not like it happens to me, said the BFG. Eyes is speaking in the most terrible Wiglish. I think you speak beautifully, Sophie said. You do? Cried the BFG, suddenly brightening. You really do? Simply beautifully, Sophie repeated. Well, that is the nicest present anyone has ever given me in my whole life, cried the BFG. Are you sure yous is not twiddling my leg? Of course not, Sophie said. I just love the way you talk. How wondercrump, cried the BFG, still beaming. How whoopsie splunkers, how absolutely squiffling. I all is a stutter. Listen, Sophie said, we don't have to eat the Snozzcumbers. In the field around the village, there are all sorts of lovely vegetables like cauliflower and carrots. Why don't you get some of those next time you go visiting? The BFG raised his head proudly in the air. Eyes is a very honorable giant, he said. I would rather be chewing up some rotsome Snozzcumbers than snitching things from other people. You stole me, Sophie said. I didn't steal you very much, said the BFG, smiling. After all, Yous is only a tiny girl. And that is the end of the chapter about the Snozzcumbers. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, Snozzcumbers kind of sound like cucumbers. But I don't think it tastes like a cucumber. But who knows? Maybe to a giant, that's what it could taste like. Who knows? We are going to do one more chapter today. It is called The Bloodbottler. Suddenly, a tremendous thumping noise came from outside the cave entrance, and a voice like thunder shouted, Runt! Is you in there, Runt? I's is hearing you jabblin'. Who's you jabblin' to, Runt? Look out, cried the BFG. It's the Bloodbottler. But before he had even finished speaking, the stone was rolled aside, and a 50-foot giant, more than twice as tall and wide as the BFG, came striding into the cave. He was naked except for a dirty little piece of cloth around his bottom. Sophie was on the tabletop. The enormous, partly eaten Snozzcumber was lying near her. She ducked behind it. The creature came clumping into the cave and stood towering over the BFG. Who was you jabblin' to in here just now? He boomed. I was jabblin' to myself, said the BFG. Sizzle fizz, shouted the Bloodbottler. Bugs wallop, he boomed. Yous is talking to a human being, that's what I's is thinking. No, cried the BFG. Yus, boomed the Bloodbottler. I's is guessing you has snitched away a human being and brought it back to your bunghole as a pet. So now I's is winking it out and guzzling it as an extra snack before my supper. The poor BFG was very nervous. There's no one in here, he stammered. Why don't you just leave me alone? The Bloodbottler pointed a finger as large as a tree trunk at the BFG. Runty little scum screwer, he shouted. Fiffling little swish fligger. Squimping little bottle wart. Prunty little paws wiggler. I's is going to search the primrose. He grabbed the BFG by the arm. And yous is going to help me do it. Us together is going to winkle out this tasteful little human being, he shouted. The BFG had intended to whisk Sophie off the table as soon as he got the chance and hide her behind his back. But now there was no hope in doing this. Sophie peered around the chewed-off end of the enormous Snozzcumber, watching the two giants as they moved away down the cave. The Bloodbottler was a gruesome sight. His skin was a reddish brown. There was black hair sprouting on his chest, his arms, and his stomach. The hair on his head was long and dark and tangled. His foul face was round and squashy looking. The eyes were tiny black holes. The nose was small and flat, but the mouth was huge. It spread right across the face, almost ear to ear. It had lips that were like two gigantic purple frankfurters, lying one on top of the other. Craggy yellow teeth stuck out between the two purple frankfurter lips, and rivers of spit ran down his chin. It was not in the least difficult to believe that this ghastly brute ate men, women, and children every night. The Bloodbottler, still holding the BFG by the arm, was examining rows and rows of bottles. You and your pibbling bottles, he shouted. What is you putting in them? Nothing that would interest you, the BFG answered. So that kind of gives you a good look at what the Bloodbottler looks like. Pretty gross, huh? Yous is only interested in guzzling human beings, and uses Dottie as a dog waggler, cried the Bloodbottler. Soon as the Bloodbottler would be coming back, Sophie told herself, and he was bound to search the tabletop. But she couldn't possibly jump off the table. It was 12 feet high. She'd break a leg. The Snozzcumber, although it was thick as a perambulator, was not going to hide her if the Bloodbottler picked it up. She examined the chewed-off end. It had large seeds in the middle. Each one was as big as a melon. They were embedded in a soft, slimy stuff. Taking care to stay out of sight, Sophie reached forward and scooped out half a dozen of those seeds. This left a hole in the middle of the Snozzcumber, large enough for her to crouch in so long as she rolled herself up into a ball. She crawled into it. It was a wet and slimy hiding place, but what mattered was that if she was going to save her from being eaten. The Bloodbottler and the BFG were coming back towards the table now. The BFG was nearly fainting with fear. At any moment, he was telling himself, Sophie would be discovered and eaten. Suddenly, the Bloodbottler grabbed the half-eaten Snozzcumber. The BFG stared at the bare table. Sophie, where is you? He thought desperately. You cannot possibly be jumpellin' off a high table. So where is you hiding, Sophie? So this is the filthing, rotsome glubbage yous is eating, boomed the Bloodbottler, holding up the partly eaten Snozzcumber. You must be cockles for guzzling such rubble squash. For a moment, the Bloodbottler seemed to have forgotten about his search for Sophie. The BFG decided to lead him further off track. That is the scrum-diddly-umptious Snozzcumber, he said. I's is guzzling it gleefully every night and day. Is you never trying a Snozzcumber, Bloodbottler? Human beans is juicier, the Bloodbottler said. Yous is talkin' rummy-tot, said the BFG, growing braver by the second. He was thinking that if only he could get the Bloodbottler to take one bite of this repulsive vegetable, the sheer foulness of his flavor would send him bellowing out of the cave. I is happy to let you sample it, the BFG went on. But please, when you see how truly glumptuous it is, do not be guzzling the whole thing. Leave me a little snitchet for my supper. The Bloodbottler stared suspiciously with small piggy eyes at the Snozzcumber. Sophie, crouching inside the chewed-off end, began to tremble all over. Yous is not switch-fiddling me, are you? Said the Bloodbottler. Never, cried the BFG passionately. Take a bite, and I am positive that you will be shouting out how scrum-diddly-umptious and wonderveg it is. The BFG could see the greedy Bloodbottler's mouth beginning to water more than ever at the prospect of extra food. Vegetables is very good for you, he went on. It's not the healthsome always be eatin' meaty things. Just this once, the Bloodbottler said. I's is goin' to taste the rotsome eats of yours, but I's is warnin' you that if it's filsome, I's is smashin' you all over your sludgy little head. He picked up the Snozzcumber. He began raising it on its journey to his mouth, some 50 feet up in the air. Sophie wanted to scream, "Don't!" but that would have been even more certain death. Crouching among the slimy seeds, she felt herself being lifted up and up and up, and then suddenly there was a crunch as the Bloodbottler bit a huge chunk off the end. Sophie saw his yellow teeth clamping together a few inches from her head. Then there was utter darkness. She was in his mouth. She caught a whiff of his evil-smelling breath. It stank of bad meat. She waited for the teeth to go crunch once more, and she prayed that she would just be killed quickly. Ouch! Roared the Bloodbottler. Oh, then he spat. All the great lumps of Snozzcumber that were in his mouth, as well as Sophie herself, went shooting across the cave. If Sophie had struck the stony wall of the cave, she would most certainly have been killed. Instead, she hit the soft folds of the BFG's black cloak hanging against the wall. She dropped to the ground half stunned. She crawled under the hem of the cloak, and there she crouched. "You little swine bugler," roared the Bloodbottler. "You little pig swiller." He rushed at the BFG and smashed what was left of the Snozzcumber over his head. Fragments of the filthy vegetables splashed all over the cave. "Yous is not loving it?" the BFG asked innocently, rubbing his head. "Loving it," yelled the Bloodbottler. "That is the most disgusterous taste I have ever had touching my teeth. You must be boggles to be swallowing sludge like that. Every night you could be galloping off happy as a hamburger and gobbling up juicy human beings." "Eating human beings is wrong and evil," the BFG said. "It is guzzly and glumptuous," shouted the Bloodbottler. "And tonight I is off galloping to Chile to swallow a few human chili beans. If yous is wishing to know why I'm choosing Chile." "I's is not wishing to know anything," the BFG said, very dignified. "I's is choosing Chile," said the Bloodbottler, "because I's is fed up with the taste of Eskimos. It is important I has plenty of cold eats in this scuttling hot weather, and the next coldest thing to an Eskimo is a chili bean. Human beings from Chile is very chilly." "Horrible," the BFG said. "You ought to be ashamed. Other giants is saying all they want to do is gallop off to England to guzzle school childers." The Bloodbottler said, "I's is very fond of school chidlers. They's has a nice inky booky flavor. Perhaps I will change my mind and go to England with them." "Yous is disgusting," the BFG said. "And yous is an insult to the giant people," shouted the Bloodbottler. "You is not fit to be a giant. Yous is a squinkly little squiddler, and yous is pibbling like a pitsqueak. Yous is a cream puff nut." With that, the horrible blood-bottling giant strode out of the cave. The BFG ran to the cave entrance and quickly rolled the stone back into place. "Sophie," he whispered. "Sophie, where is you, Sophie?" Sophie emerged from under the hem of the black cloak. "I'm here," she said. The BFG picked her up and held her tenderly in the palm of his hand. "Oh, I's is so happy to be finding you all in one lump," he said. "I was in his mouth," Sophie said. "Yous was what?" cried the BFG. Sophie told him what had happened. "And there I was telling him to eat that filsome Snozzcumber, and yous was in it all the time?" the BFG cried. "Not much fun," Sophie said. "Just look at you, you poor chidler," cried the BFG. "Yous is covered in Snozzcumber and giant spit." He set about cleaning her up as best he could. "I's is hating those other giants even more now," he said. "You know what I should like?" "What?" Sophie said. "I should like to find a way of disappearing them. Every single one." "I'd be glad to help you," Sophie said. "Let me see if I can't think up a way of doing it." And that is the end of the chapter called The Bloodbottler. Now I've got to say, that is very tricky to say. Try saying that 3 times fast. Bloodbottler, Bloodbottler, Bloodbottler. Woo, it's tricky. So your writing assignment for today is going to be a little bit more creative for you. So your task is to think of a way for you. How would you make a giant disappear? Would you use a trap? Would you use magic? What would you need to make a giant disappear? So I look forward to hearing all your different strategies and different techniques. What would you use to make a giant disappear? Now remember, these things are as tall as buildings, taller than buildings. So what would you need to make one disappear? I look forward to reading your responses, and as always, I'm so happy that you joined us for our read aloud today. I look forward to having you join us next time as we continue with our story, The BFG, and find out if Sophie and the BFG can come up with a plan to make these giants disappear. Tune in next time as we continue on reading our story, The BFG by Roald Dahl. Have a great day.